consistently near-death experiencers come back and they say, I don't fear death anymore. In fact, I can't wait, because they have experienced the reality of a life to come that, by the way, is not different from this life. We sometimes think of the life to come as ethereal, wispy, ghosty, And yet what they consistently say is, no, there's a physicality to it. It is more real. The spiritual is the foundation of all the physical we experience. And yet what they say is, this actually is the shadow. That's the real thing.
Welcome. My guest today on Heaven Encounters is John Burke. He is the founder of Gateway Church in Austin, Texas. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Imagine Heaven, and he has authored a new book that I'm showing you here, which is Imagine the God of Heaven. He chronologues 70 people in here, stories from across the globe. Welcome, John, to our program today.
Hey, great to see you again, Randy. Thanks for having me on.
Well, John, we've been friends now for some time, and you weren't always in the space of researching, and you have now for over 30 years, near-death experience stories. You were a skeptic at one point, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. I was agnostic. I was a skeptic. I was an engineer by trade and training. And so I was always asking, well, how do you know? I was never a big fan of just blind faith, because I thought, well, how do you know? And if you're going to bet your life on something, you need to have some assurance. And my dad was dying of cancer, and someone gave him the very first research on what's now called near-death experiences. When someone clinically dies, and yet either modern medicine or miracle resuscitates them, and some minutes, some hours, and yet they come back talking about the reality of a life to come, as you know, because that's how we met, you sharing with me your near-death experience when you were clinically dead for 30 minutes.
Yes, that is how we met, and that's the first time I shared with somebody at that point that I didn't really know well. But now you have interviewed people from around the world, and they have either a near-death or afterlife experience where I think in your book, actually, you chronologue those who have clinically died, their heart stopped.
Yeah, and that's what I focus on, because I just got curious about this, and over the last 35 years, I've either researched or interviewed over 1,000 people. And in this new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, 70 people who've had near-death experiences from all over the world. And what I like to point out is these are people who don't have any reason to make up these crazy stories. Like, you were a CEO. I interview spine surgeons, commercial airline pilots, bank presidents, doctors, and nurses. They don't gain anything by talking about these crazy stories. And yet, what convinced me that there's something real here also convinced many medical doctors. For instance, people don't realize it, but these are very normal, actually. The European Academy of Neurology did a study in 2019 across 35 countries and found that 5%, or 1 out of 20 people across 35 countries, claimed to have a near-death experience when they were clinically dead. They come back talking about the reality of a life to come and a world to come that they say is more real than this life. And there have actually been 900 scholarly articles written about this in everything from the Journal of the American Medical Association to The Lancet, Europe's most prestigious medical journal. And what convinced me as a skeptical engineer, and what's convinced so many medical doctors, is that when people leave their body, when they first die, they're still often in the room watching their resuscitation, but from above, when they shouldn't be able to remember anything because they had no brain waves. And yet when they come back, they can report verifiable observations, and studies have been done showing that the observations they make are 92% completely accurate, another 6%, all their observations are accurate. Only 2% in this study were inaccurate. And that was actually one patient who, was not probably, was probably making it up. I don't know.
Well, I guess there are a few of those, but you have interviewed the ones where, for the most part, I think they had clinical evidence to verify that they were dead, clinically dead. And you interviewed them from across the world, different religions. So it wasn't one religion versus another. I mean, there was a broad spectrum of people who had different beliefs, agnostic to different religions, didn't you?
Yes, and in the book Imagine the God of Heaven, I chronicle, like you said, 70 people who clinically died from every continent. And what's fascinating, and what I'm pointing out, is that consistently on every continent, 48% of those having near-death experience encounter who they know to be God. It's fascinating. There's no question about it to them. And this actually is the same God, no matter their religious background. They may interpret this different, but what I'm showing they report is this God that often they describe as brighter than the sun, like by thousands of times, and yet not hard to look at. In fact, mesmerizing. But the light of God is not just light like the sun's light. It's also love and life. And in this God's presence, he's incredibly personal. Like he knows them better than anybody's ever known them, loves them unconditionally. And even many, as you know, say our word love doesn't do it justice. Like it doesn't even come close to the way God loves each unique individual. And oftentimes he gives them a life review. So they revisit their lives, maybe in whole or parts. Like you had kind of different parts where God shows you some things and he's pointing things out. But invariably across the globe, they come back saying God is love, and how we love or treat one another is what God cares most about.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating for a number of reasons, one of which is these people who came from, let's say, Santosh, a Hindu background,
right,
or Steve Kang, who came from a Buddhist background,
or Heidi, who was Jewish.
Yes.
Others from the Middle East who, had a Muslim background. I interview a Rwandan imam who, was Muslim as well. Yet they're saying they're not necessarily seeing and reporting what they would normally anticipate in that culture. And yet what is being reported consistently is this same God of light and love.
And there's a transformational effect, because the people that you interview don't come back the same. They're changed invariably, aren't they? And there's something there that the introduction to God, and they see God in maybe different ways, but they all come back different people, don't they?
Yes. And that in chapter 2 of Imagine God of Heaven, I talk about NDE, science, and skeptics. And I give 10 points of evidence that convince me. And, one of them I talked about already is observational evidence that can be checked out. But there are others too. One is why would 48% see the same God and yet not necessarily the God they anticipated? Or in some cases, like, Jim Woodford, he was an agnostic, or Howard Storm, who was a professor, he was an atheist. And yet they come back talking about the reality of this God who is the same, and in some cases who rescues them when they cry out to them. That's not where their experience necessarily started, but they cry out to him. and he rescues them, and they come back and they're changed. And that's what I like to point out is one point of evidence is changed lives. When people have a cardiac arrest, it doesn't necessarily so radically change their life. But when they've had a near-death experience during their cardiac arrest, and there have been studies done showing the difference, there is a drastic spiritual influence on their lives when they come back. One more really powerful point of evidence is that blind people, when they die, they can see, and they see the same things, and they describe God in the same way as this light brighter than the sun, light coming out of him, but not just light like we would feel, they would feel on earth, but love and life in the same way. And yet when they come back, they still can't see. But they're reporting all the same things that other near-death experiencers see, heavenly beauty. They meet their deceased relatives. I have Debbie as one blind person in Imagine the God of Heaven that I report on. And not only does she encounter the same God, but she also sees, her body on the floor, and her mother come into the room and told her mother after she came back, "You were wearing a robe and it was a dark color." And she said, "Yes, it was a black robe." But she couldn't see. And then she also in heaven meets her grandmother, who she had never known because her grandmother died before, she was old enough to know her. And she describes her grandmother, her features and what she looked like and everything. But she described her as a 30-year-old. And her mother was like, "Yes, but that's what she looked like when she was younger." Isn't that fascinating? As you and I were joking about, using our earlier age pictures, and how, people say, "Hey, you need a more up-to-date picture." And now I like to say, well, that's my future picture.
We were talking about that and how we were going to not apologize for posting a 30-year-old picture, because that seems to be the age at which
look like.
Most of them are looking like they were in about their early 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a phenomenon also in terms of the person who hears about these stories, John, and maybe goes into it like you and I, actually. You from the perspective of the researcher, me from the perspective pre-near-death experience, or my pre-near afterlife, where we didn't believe. And so they're looking at this from that point of view. Well, what is the most telling, either story or research, that validates these experiences in light of that research, and also that might speak to some of the religious arguments against them?
Well, I find the power of evidence that, any one of them could be making it up. I don't think most are, but even if they were, you could replace what they're saying with thousands more. But if I were going to pick one that has convinced many skeptical doctors and scientists, it would probably be Pam Reynolds. And I report on Pam Reynolds in chapter 2 of Imagine the God of Heaven, because Pam, she was an American singer-songwriter who had a deep brain aneurysm, which they have to saw open her skull and go down deep into as a former medical executive more than I do, but you're having to go deep into the brain. And to do this, they had to basically kill her. It's this wild surgery where they lower your body temperature to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They drain out all your blood. They basically stop you. They stop your heart. And then Pam had 100 decibel clicks in her ears and her eyes taped shut so that nothing would be seen or heard to give brain waves, because they didn't want any brain activity. So they're monitoring to make sure there's no brain activity. Now think about it. If our current modern medical, which is actually, this is changing a lot of doctors and medicine's idea of what the soul and the body is. But if we were just material, in other words, all our thinking, all our reasoning, all our feelings are just blips in the brain, they shouldn't experience anything. They shouldn't retain any memory. And yet during a 2-hour surgery, About an hour into the surgery, in the deepest anesthesia, the doctor takes out the saw and begins to cut into her head. Now, Pam claims she left her body. She was there watching the surgery. She heard earlier on a female doctor say, we can't find the artery. And the other doctor say, try the left leg. And she was a little confused because they thought, she said they were doing brain surgery. Why? I didn't know there was a female doctor going to be a female doctor in the room. And why was she down by my legs? Well, later, that's exactly what had happened. They couldn't find the femoral artery in one leg. Then, an hour into the surgery, she describes them sawing open her head, but not with what she would think is a saw. It looked more like an electric toothbrush. And there was what she said was like a socket set of, like drill bits, like her father's drill bit set that the doctor reached into. Well, all that, the neurosurgeon, Dr. Spetzler, confirmed. That all happened. Pam then has a transcendental experience where she travels to this place where she meets her grandmother, and she knows this God of light and love is there, and she knows she has to go back. And as she's going back into the room, she hears them playing the song Hotel California, and they shocked her with paddles, but not once, they shocked her twice. Now, all those details she could describe, and yet just a blip of the brain or anesthesia or, fighter pilot syndrome where you have anoxia, low oxygen. None of those alternate explanations can account for all those details.
That's something, having worked in the operating room, that people don't know, that oftentimes the surgeon will play music, their favorite music, while performing surgery. So that in and of itself is proof in light of most people not knowing that. Another thing is the clarity with which people remember these stories. We've heard from your book that many consider heaven, for example, to be more real than this world, which is a conundrum. And also, of course, the brain death does not permit any imagination. And even the dreams that one might have, they are very ambiguous, very kind of in a way that cannot be remembered distinctly. But these are very different.
Sensorium, and yet a near-death experience consistently around the globe, they say, is more lucid, more vivid, colors beyond our color spectrum. They talk about the light of heaven that comes out of everything. And I show how this actually is an expectation that God has been showing in the scriptures throughout history. In the book of Isaiah 60, the prophet Isaiah says in heaven, there is no sun or moon, the light is the glory of God. And in the book of Revelation, John says the same thing, and then says the nations will walk in that light. Now imagine when you have a 16-year-old Jewish girl who was raised by atheist parents who told her your life is worthless, there is no God, Jesus Christ is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. And yet she always believed in God. And it was actually a pretty abusive house. And she would pray to God every night and felt comforted by this God she couldn't see, and felt almost like he was there putting her to sleep at night as a little girl. And yet when her horse crushes her at 16, falls on her, she's up 30 feet in the air. She knows she's dead. And this brilliant light, this God of light is there, and she turns and looks, and she said, I saw Jesus. And she said, I knew who he was. I wasn't like, what's a nice Jewish girl like me doing seeing Jesus? I shouldn't be seeing Jesus. She said, no, I knew him. And I knew he was the God that I had been praying to. And in her life review, Jesus shows her that he was the one sitting by her bed at night. She saw that. And then he takes her to heaven, where she experiences the infinitesimal God. So she experiences a light that he takes her into that she says was also love and was infinite in scope. And the next thing she knows, she finds herself like describing what Isaiah described in Isaiah chapter 6 of the throne of God and this incredible God of power and yet also of love. And she finds herself there in his embrace, she said. It's like, what's difficult for us is that when you guys try to describe this, what I've come to realize is you're trying to describe in in our three-dimensional world, something that has only a description in multi-dimensions. And so it sounds confusing, or because even Heidi said, there was only one God, but I knew that this God, the Father and Jesus were one and yet separate. And she said, I don't understand and I can't explain how God can be a light and God can be love and God can be a man. I can't explain it, but that's what I experienced.
Uh-huh.
Now, when you also take Muslims in Tehran, who I interviewed and report on in Imagine the God of Heaven, who when they clinically die, she had a heart attack, and she sees the same exact God that you mentioned, Santosh, who was Hindu, who had no expectation but of this almighty, powerful God who also appears as huge, but a man with a beard and a robe with the light of the sun coming out of him, and his eyes like lightning, right? And yet to this woman in Tehran, he says, I am he who is. Well, that, by the way, is exactly what Yahweh, God, said to Moses 3,500 years ago when Moses sees a brilliant light in a bush that wouldn't burn up on Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Right? And so what I show is that consistently throughout history, God has been revealing himself, and he's been revealing himself as the God of all nations. So all the way back, Moses writing in Genesis chapter 12, God says, I'm going to raise up a people from Abraham and Sarah, and you are going to be a blessing to all the nations. And this is what I like to point out, is that this same God has always cared for every person of every nation. He's not a respecter of people. He loves every person he created because he created every person to be his own child. And what they consistently say is in his presence, they feel more loved than the love you would have for your children or grandchildren, more love than you would feel for your closest sibling or best friend, more love than you would have or would feel from a spouse. Mm. This is the love we've always wanted. And that's consistent across the globe for every person of every nation.
The God of love sounds cliche until you meet him. And that's what you're talking to those, including yours truly, that met God. And what you say is the universal aspect of God as love, that he's not angry with us, that he loves us consummately. And that's something that's hard for many to get their heads around because it's not a condition of their thinking necessarily, is it? Because many of these people are, obviously, they're not thinking, they don't have a brain function. So right. That comes from a different place, doesn't it?
Well, and also, why would so many people all around the globe experience the same God when they didn't necessarily have that? I mean, we know people who are atheists and agnostics, and they're saying the same thing when they come back. And yes, so what you realize about this God is that, I love what Ron, Ron, Dr. Ron Smotherman,
psychiatrist,
who is a medical doctor, psychiatrist, and neurologist. And he actually had a guy who was staying with him, have a psychotic break and attack him and stabbed him 13 times. He showed me the knife wound going all the way through his neck. He should not have lived. And right at the 14th, right before he went for the heart, Ron said it was like time stopped, and suddenly before me was this brilliant light that he knew was divine. Just like Santosh, the Hindu guy, said, just like Swadik said, this man of brilliant light, brighter than the sun. And yet Ron said, imagine standing 5 feet from a nuclear explosion. That's what it was like. It was roiling, just so much energy. But he said, but what was roiling even more with energy was the love. And he said, this is love of another magnitude. He said, all human love, imagine like standing in the gentle waves of the ocean and they're lapping against your legs. And then imagine seeing a tsunami come. That's God's love in comparison. And he said, but like a tsunami would wash away life, this tsunami washes away all fear, all worry, all concern. This heals all your hurts, And so he said infinite love was the first quality, but then 9 qualities just imprinted themselves on him. And this is part of what I'm trying to do in Imagine the God of Heaven, is show all these overlapping things that near-death experiencers say, and how there's similar qualities of this God who's revealed himself for thousands of years, like knowledge, like Ron said, infinite knowledge. I knew it. It appeared to me as a vision of a library filling the universe, and God wrote every book. And then he said his power was indisputable, like beyond a nuclear explosion. He said his authority was such that you would do anything he said because you knew he was right and it was good. And then he said kindness. Imagine the kindest person you know, multiply it times 1,000. And then some surprising things he said. Joy. He said, even as I was interviewing him, and he was talking about joy, and then he had to catch himself because he said, it'll make you happy for a lifetime, but even thinking about the joy, I get overwhelmed with ecstasy. It's like ecstasy, which I know you experienced, didn't you?
Yes.
When you drank from that river of life.
Yeah, it's such a contrast to this world, isn't it, oftentimes? And yet there's a difficulty in coming back to this world, those who have experienced an encounter with God, the God of life, the God of love. And yet the biggest fear, number one, I think, or number two, I think it's the biggest fear, it's the fear of death. The fear of death is faces everyone that has to go through. So there's something, a translation to one who is reading your book and the stories in your book and listening to this interview, that helps to overcome that fear of death. And people who have lost loved ones, people who are facing death at one point in their life, maybe 50 years from now or maybe next week. Talk to us about the effect of these stories that you've chronologued that overcome that fear of death to another hope that translates far beyond what one can intellectualize.
Yeah. Well, consistently, in the presence of this God of light and love, God gives people a life review. About 30% of near-death experiencers, 33% say they had this kind of life review. And in that life review, and I think the fear of death has 2 components. One is just fear of the unknown. And consistently near-death experiencers come back and they say, I don't fear death anymore. Mm-hmm. In fact, I can't wait. Because they have experienced the reality of a life to come that, by the way, is not different from this life. We sometimes think of the life to come as ethereal, wispy, ghosty, and yet what they consistently say is, no, there's a physicality to it. It is more real. The spiritual is the foundation of all the physical we experience. And yet what they say is this actually is the shadow. That's the real thing. And so they lose their fear of death because also, many say, like I think about the spinal surgeon, Dr. Mary Neal, who died when her kayak was pinned under a waterfall and she was dead 30 minutes, but she said, I don't remember ever dying. I didn't go from life to death. I went from life to more life. And she knew God was holding her and gave her this life review. Now, I think the second part of death that many people fear, and even maybe fearing God, is that we all know we've done good, but we also know we've done wrong. And we might run a lifetime from that, and we might try to ignore that or try to patch it up. And yet people consistently say in God's presence, like there's no hiding the truth. It's like you see you're good, but you also see, your wrongs and all the hurts you caused other people. And what God is consistently showing, he never removes his unconditional love. It's a very important thing. Even the best parent, when we try to discipline our kids, many times we remove our love. God never removes his love. There's nothing that could make you, there's nothing you could do to make him love you more, and there's nothing you could do to make him love you less. And what they also experience is that he's a God who, for some reason, offers mercy and compassion. Santosh, the manufacturing engineer who grew up in India, Hindu, is standing before this magnificent, almighty God. And when he looks into his eyes, he said his eyes were like lightning, which is what Daniel describes in Daniel chapter 10, one of the Old Testament prophets, seeing the same God. It's what John describes in Revelation chapter 1. So that's who he's describing. And yet, when God speaks to him, he says, Santosh, I'm sending you back. And when you go back, you must love your family, especially your daughter. She needs you right now. Which is amazing. Like, he didn't know God, but God knew him and even his daughter and what she needed from him and cared about that. And Santosh said, I feared because I saw my sins. But when I heard from the Lord, what I heard in his voice was tenderness and mercy and compassion and love. And as a result, he said, Lord, when I come back, I want to go. He's describing this holy city that he's seen that is exactly like other indie eaters saw. It's exactly what John describes in Revelation chapter 21. I mean, it's unbelievable because there's no reason he should be reporting that same exact thing. And yet he is. And he says he wants to be there and come back. And what he discovered, and this is what can take away our fear of knowing that we've all done wrong, is he discovered that God is a God of forgiveness. He's a God of justice. And what Santosh said is he's holy. And interestingly, Dr. Ron Smotherman described holy, because it was one of the traits he said, as pure. He described it as pure and innocent, but not naive. He said, against what that quality was, I saw what I wasn't. I'm not naive. I'm not pure. I'm not innocent. I'm guilty. And yet what people consistently say is that though God is a God of justice and holiness, he's also a God of forgiveness. And what Santosh came back and discovered, because he was seeking God when he came back, and what he discovered is that God actually was foretelling for thousands of years through prophets in the Old Testament scriptures that he would send a Messiah who would pay for the sins of all humanity, of all nations. It's right there in Isaiah chapter 52 and 53, and in other places as well. And he discovered that this God wants us to have confidence that, yes, though we've all failed, though we've all sinned, we can all know that God has forgiven us already. He's already done that for us. And the only thing that can keep a person out of God's presence for eternity, or out of heaven for eternity, is our own free will. You know, the motive that God has for everything, which, by the way, helps answer a lot of the why God questions we have, right? Why do you allow so much suffering? Why don't you just show up? Why don't you just tell me what to? Why are you making me go through all those? The reason is because of love, which may sound skewed at first. But anyone who's been in love realizes you can't force, coerce, or buy love. It has to be free. You can't force your children to love you as they grow up. You can't force someone you love to love you. They have to be free. And that's even true with God. And so the only thing that can keep us out of God's presence for eternity is if we truly don't want him. We don't want his love. We don't want his forgiveness. We don't care about what he offered through the Messiah, or we don't care to seek to see if there's really evidence, which there is. There's incredible evidence. But if we, so that's the only thing. And if you don't have like a ego resistance to that, if what you want is God and to seek God, man, God says, you'll find me. And there is no fear of death, because death is just a step into real life. And we know that even though we've made mistakes in this life, what God was really after is just our hearts turning to him in love and to be his children for eternity.
Wow. I love that we're ending on the God of love, and something that you also said, which is, if you don't know the God of love, then ask the God of love to reveal himself to you. And like me, as a former agnostic, he will do that. And so, John, this has been such a great pleasure. Imagine the God of Heaven, your new book. I highly recommend it. I had the pleasure of seeing my name in there too. So you can hear a lot of great stories from many of our mutual friends. So, John, thank you for this time. And thank you for all you've done to validate our stories and to help others understand them.
Well, thanks so much, Randy. Appreciate it.
Okay, so now we have some great news. That if you know the God of love and you have him in your heart, then be of good cheer, because heaven is in your future. Take care, and God bless.
Heaven is coming to San Diego at the first Heaven Encounters event this September 12th through 14th, 2024. World-renowned speakers, best-selling authors, and the largest ever gathering of Christian afterlife survivors will join host Randy Kay. Transformative presentations will be accompanied by dynamic worship, engaging panel discussions, inspiring ceremonies, and life-changing prayer at one of America's premier Christian conference resorts. Register now at randykay.org, as seating availability is limited. Heaven is coming to San Diego. Don't miss it.
Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. And if you'd like further information, go to our website at randykay.org, where our mission is simple: to share the great news of God's love.